They cornered him in the bathroom with electric clippers, laughing about how they'd finally teach the weird kid a lesson. What they didn't know was that those thick eyebrows they wanted to shave off belonged to someone who had been holding back, a power that would leave them sobbing on the cold tile floor. This is the story of Ethan Miller and how 40 seconds changed everything at Pine Valley High School forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The autumn rain drummed against the windows of Pine Valley. High school students shuffled through the hallways, their conversations mixing with the squeak of sneakers on polished floors. Pine Valley was the kind of small Oregon town where everyone knew everyone else's business, where the local diner served as the unofficial community center, and where high school social hierarchies felt as permanent as the surrounding mountains. In this world of established pecking orders and unspoken rules, Ethan Miller had somehow managed to become invisible, which was exactly how he preferred it. Ethan was 16, with dark hair that perpetually fell across his forehead and a habit of wearing oversized hoodies that seemed to swallow his lean frame. His most distinctive feature, the one that would soon become the center of unwanted attention, was his remarkably thick, dark eyebrows that gave his face an intensity he tried desperately to downplay. He moved through the halls like a ghost, always carrying a worn backpack stuffed with textbooks, always looking down, always alone. To his classmates, he appeared to be nothing more than another awkward junior trying to survive high school without making waves. What none of them knew, what Ethan had never told a single soul at Pine Valley High, was that behind his shy exterior lay a secret that would have fundamentally changed how they saw him. For the past 8 years, since he was 8 years old, Ethan had been training in mixed martial arts at a small, unassuming gym on the outskirts of town. His father, David Miller, who worked long hours as a mechanic at the local auto shop, had started taking Ethan to the gym after a particularly brutal incident in elementary school, where older kids had beaten him up for his lunch money. The gym, run by a former professional fighter named Coach Martinez, had become Ethan's second home. While other kids his age were playing video games or hanging out at the mall, Ethan was learning the intricate art of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, the explosive power of Muay Thai, and the disciplined precision of boxing. Coach Martinez had seen something special in the quiet boy with the intense eyes, a natural ability to read opponents, and an almost supernatural awareness of spatial relationships and timing. By age 14, Ethan was regularly sparring with adult fighters and winning regional tournaments under an assumed name to maintain his privacy. But Ethan had made a promise to his parents, particularly to his mother Sarah, who worked night shifts as a nurse at Pine Valley General Hospital. After a tournament injury that had left him with a concussion, she had made him swear that he would never use his skills outside the gym unless his life was genuinely in danger. The promise had been easy to make because Ethan genuinely believed in avoiding conflict. He had seen what violence could do, had witnessed the aftermath of fights in his mother's emergency room stories, and had no desire to hurt anyone unnecessarily. This philosophy of avoidance had served him well for 2 years at Pine Valley High. He kept his head down, did his homework, ate lunch alone in the library, and somehow managed to graduate from middle school to high school without attracting the attention of the school's more predatory social elements. He was the kind of student teachers barely remembered, the type who turned in assignments on time but never spoke up in class, who existed in that vast middle ground between the popular kids and the obvious targets. Unfortunately for Ethan, his carefully maintained invisibility was about to be shattered by the worst possible person, Connor Walsh. Connor was everything Ethan was not. 17 years old and built like the wrestling champion he was, Connor stood 6 feet tall with the kind of confident swagger that came from never having to question his place in the social hierarchy. His father, Michael Walsh, owned the largest construction company in Pine Valley, which meant the Walsh family had money, influence, and the kind of small-town power that made people look the other way when Connor's behavior crossed lines. Connor's blonde hair was always perfectly styled, his clothes were always expensive, and his smile was the kind that could charm adults while hiding a cruel streak that his peers knew all too well. As the captain of Pine Valley High's wrestling team, Connor was used to physical dominance. He had been wrestling since elementary school and had the kind of natural athleticism that made him genuinely formidable in legitimate competition. But Connor's need for dominance didn't stop at the wrestling mat. He had discovered early in his high school career that his combination of physical presence, social status, and family connections made him essentially untouchable when it came to disciplinary consequences. Teachers who might have called out other students for their behavior somehow found reasons to overlook Connor's transgressions, and administrators who should have intervened often found themselves having uncomfortable conversations with Michael Walsh about school policies. Connor's inner circle consisted of two equally problematic individuals who enabled and amplified his worst tendencies. Blake Harrison was Connor's best friend since childhood, a 16-year-old junior whose primary role in life seemed to be documenting Connor's exploits for social media. Blake was smaller than Connor, but made up for his lack of physical presence. With a cruel wit and an obsession with recording everything that happened around him, he treated Connor's bullying like entertainment, always ready with his phone to capture moments of humiliation that could be shared, reshared, and turned into viral content that extended the torment far beyond the initial incident. The third member of this toxic triangle was Sophia Rivers, Connor's on and off girlfriend, whose relationship status seemed to fluctuate based on her mood and his behavior. Sophia was a cheerleader with the kind of calculated mean girl persona that had been perfected over generations of high school social warfare. She was pretty in the conventional sense, with long blonde hair and the kind of carefully curated appearance that suggested significant time and money spent on maintenance, but her real power came from her social intelligence, her ability to identify weakness and exploit it with surgical precision. Together, Connor, Blake, and Sophia formed a predatory unit that had terrorized Pine Valley High's more vulnerable students for years. Their methods were sophisticated, designed to maximize humiliation while minimizing the chances of serious disciplinary action. They understood instinctively how to walk the line between harassment and behavior that adults might dismiss as typical teenage drama. They were experts at choosing victims who were unlikely to fight back or report them, and they had perfected the art of making their cruelty look like harmless pranks to any adult who might be watching. For 2.5 years, Ethan had successfully avoided their attention through a combination of careful timing, strategic invisibility, and sheer luck. He knew their patterns, understood their hunting grounds, and had developed an almost supernatural ability to be somewhere else whenever they were looking for entertainment. He ate lunch in the library instead of the cafeteria, took alternate routes between classes to avoid the hallways where they congregated, and had even memorized their schedules to minimize unwanted encounters. But fate, as it often does, had other plans. It started on a Tuesday morning in late October when Pine Valley High's chemistry teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, announced a new seating arrangement that would randomly pair students for a semester-long project on molecular structures. Ethan, who had been safely anonymous in the back corner of the classroom, found himself assigned to work with Jessica Chen, a quiet sophomore who was widely regarded as one of the smartest students in the school. Jessica was Asian American, soft-spoken, and had the kind of intellectual intensity that made her a natural target for students like Connor, who viewed academic success as a threat to their own social dominance. The pairing itself wouldn't have been a problem, except for one crucial detail. Jessica was also the younger sister of Tommy Chen, who had been Connor's primary rival on the wrestling team before graduating the previous year. Tommy had been one of the few students at Pine Valley High who had ever stood up to Connor directly, and their rivalry had been legendary among students who followed school sports. Tommy's graduation had left Connor without his favorite opponent, and he had never forgiven what he saw as a humiliating final defeat in the regional championships. When Connor saw Ethan and Jessica working together in chemistry class, bent over their notebooks and discussing molecular bonds with the kind of quiet intensity that suggested genuine intellectual engagement, something clicked in his predatory brain. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Here was an opportunity to settle an old score while establishing dominance over two targets simultaneously. Jessica represented unfinished business with her brother, while Ethan represented the kind of easy victim that Connor preferred. Isolated, apparently defenseless, and unlikely to fight back, the campaign began subtly, as these things always did. Connor started with small gestures designed to test boundaries and establish patterns. A deliberately hard shoulder check in the hallway that sent Ethan stumbling into lockers while Connor apologized with exaggerated sincerity. They accidentally spilled energy drink that soaked Ethan's backpack and forced him to spend his lunch period in the bathroom cleaning chemistry notes that couldn't be replaced. Comments about Ethan's appearance, his clothes, his obvious lack of social connections, delivered just loudly enough for nearby students to hear, but just quietly enough to avoid adult attention. Blake documented everything, of course. His phone was always ready to capture moments of humiliation, and he had developed an artist's eye for finding the most embarrassing angles and expressions. The videos never showed Connor's initial provocations, only Ethan's reactions, stumbling, fumbling, looking confused and helpless. Blake would edit these clips with trending audio and post them to social media platforms where Pine Valley High students gathered, creating a digital paper trail of embarrassment that followed Ethan home and made his weekends as miserable as his school days. Sophia's contributions were more psychological but equally damaging. She had a talent for spreading rumors and manufacturing social situations that increased Ethan's isolation. She would approach other students with concerned expressions and helpful suggestions about avoiding weird Ethan, claiming to have heard disturbing things about his family or his behavior. She was careful never to make specific accusations that could be traced back to her, but her campaign of whispered implications was devastatingly effective. Students who might have been potential friends began avoiding Ethan, and teachers who had previously been neutral started viewing him with subtle suspicion. The 3-week campaign escalated steadily, following a carefully calculated progression that Connor had perfected through years of practice. Physical intimidation gave way to social isolation, which gave way to direct humiliation, which would ultimately culminate in what Connor considered his masterpiece, a public degradation so complete and so thoroughly documented that the victim would never recover their social standing. Ethan endured it all with the same stoic silence that had protected him for years. He absorbed the shoulder checks, cleaned up the spills, ignored the comments, and pretended not to see the phones that appeared whenever he stumbled or looked. Confused, his parents noticed his increased withdrawal, his reluctance to talk about school, his sudden loss of appetite at dinner. But Ethan deflected their concerns with the practiced skill of a teenager who had learned to protect adults from worries they couldn't solve. At the gym, Coach Martinez noticed changes too. Ethan's training had become more intense, more focused, with an edge of barely controlled aggression that hadn't been there before. His sparring sessions were more violent, his techniques more precise and punishing, When Coach Martinez asked about it, Ethan claimed he was preparing for a tournament that didn't exist, but the older man's experienced eyes saw something else, a young fighter preparing for a war. The breaking point came on a Friday afternoon in mid-November, during the lunch period, when most students were either in the cafeteria or hanging out in the common areas. Ethan had finished eating his sandwich in the library and was heading to his locker to get books for his afternoon classes when he realized he needed to use the restroom. The nearest bathroom was on the second floor, in a section of the building that was usually empty during lunch because it housed mostly administrative offices and unused classrooms. Ethan pushed open the bathroom door and immediately knew he had made a mistake. Connor was standing near the sinks with Blake and Sophia, and all three of them turned toward him with expressions that made his stomach drop. Blake's phone was already out and recording, and Sophia was holding something that made Ethan's blood run cold. A pair of electric hair clippers, the kind used in barbershops for precision cuts. "Well, well," Connor said, his voice carrying the kind of false friendliness that was always a prelude to cruelty. "Look what wandered into our little meeting." Ethan turned to leave, but Blake had already moved to block the door. The bathroom was small, with only 3 stalls and 2 sinks, and suddenly it felt like a cage. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows that made Connor's smile look even more predatory than usual. "We've been talking about you, Ethan," Sophia said, stepping forward with the clippers. "About how you always look so unkempt, so messy. We thought maybe we could help you with a little grooming." She held up the clippers and pressed the power button. They buzzed to life with an ominous electric hum that echoed off the tile walls. "Starting with those ridiculous eyebrows of yours. They're just so thick, so distracting. Don't you think he'd look better with a cleaner look, Connor?" Connor's grin widened as he stepped closer to Ethan, close enough that Ethan could smell his expensive cologne and see the cruel satisfaction in his eyes. "Absolutely. It's like a public service, really. We're just trying to help you fit in better, buddy." Blake kept filming, his excitement palpable as he captured what he clearly expected to be the climactic moment of their harassment campaign. The phone's camera lens seemed to stare at Ethan like a dead eye, promising that whatever happened next would be preserved forever, shared across social media platforms, and turned into a viral monument to his humiliation. "Hold still," Sophia said, raising the clippers toward Ethan's face. "This will only take a second." For Ethan, time seemed to slow down. He could hear his heartbeat in his ears, could feel the familiar surge of adrenaline that always preceded a fight, could sense his body automatically shifting into the combat stance that 8 years of training had made as natural as breathing. His weight settled onto the balls of his feet. His hands relaxed into the proper position. His breathing deepened and steadied. But he also heard his mother's voice, making him promise never to use violence unless his life was in danger. He saw his father's disappointed face, imagined the consequences that would follow if he hurt these students, thought about the police reports and the lawsuits and the way his family's quiet life would be destroyed by scandal. The clippers moved closer to his face, and Ethan made his choice. What happened next would be talked about at Pine Valley High School for years to come, passed down like legend from one class to the next, shared in whispered conversations and retold with increasing embellishment until it became the kind of story that seemed too dramatic to be true. But for the 4 teenagers in that bathroom, it was terrifyingly, unforgettably real. Ethan moved. Ethan's movement was so fluid, so impossibly fast, that for a split second, the 3 bullies weren't even sure what had happened. One moment Sophia was advancing with the buzzing clippers, confident in her power over the cowering victim, and the next moment she was stumbling backward, her wrist caught in an iron grip that made her gasp in shock. The clippers clattered to the floor, their electric hum dying as they skittered across the tile toward the far wall. The transformation in Ethan was immediate and complete. Gone was the hunched posture, the downcast eyes, the apologetic shuffle that had defined his presence at Pine Valley High for 2 years. In its place stood someone Connor had never seen before, someone whose very stance radiated controlled power and absolute confidence. Ethan's back was straight, his feet planted in a position that seemed casual but suggested perfect balance, and his dark eyes had taken on an intensity that made Connor's stomach clench with sudden, inexplicable fear. "Let go of me," Sophia hissed, trying to twist her wrist free from Ethan's grip. But his fingers remained locked around her wrist with the kind of precise pressure that controlled without causing damage, a technique that spoke of years of training in exactly how much force to apply and where. "I will," Ethan said, his voice calm and steady in a way that was somehow more frightening than if he had shouted. "As soon as you step back and give me some space." Blake, still holding his phone but no longer focused on filming, took an uncertain step forward. "Dude, what the hell? Let her go right now or I'm calling security." Connor, who had been frozen, in shock for those crucial first seconds, finally found his voice. "Yeah, freak, you better let go of my girlfriend before I make you regret it." But even as he spoke the words, something in Ethan's posture made him hesitate. This wasn't the same terrified kid he had been tormenting for weeks. This person standing in front of him moved like a predator, like someone who understood violence in ways Connor had never had to consider. Ethan released Sophia's wrist and she stumbled backward, rubbing the spot where his fingers had been. There would be no bruising, no visible marks, but the precise nature of his grip had made it clear that he could have caused serious damage if he had chosen to. The bathroom suddenly felt smaller, the fluorescent light seemed harsher, and the three bullies found themselves backing toward the door without consciously deciding to retreat. "This isn't over," Connor said, his voice carrying less conviction than usual. "You just made the biggest mistake of your pathetic life." But as the three of them filed out of the bathroom, Blake's phone still recording their hasty exit, Connor couldn't shake the image of Ethan's eyes. There had been something in them that Connor had never seen before, a kind of controlled fury that suggested depths of capability he had never imagined. For the first time in his high school career, Connor Walsh felt the unfamiliar sensation of genuine uncertainty. Over the next 3 days, word of the bathroom incident spread through Pine Valley High with the speed that only teenage gossip could achieve. The story grew and changed with each telling, becoming more dramatic and more distorted as it passed from one student to another. In some versions, Ethan had thrown Sophia across the room. In others, he had threatened to break Connor's arm. The truth, that he had simply defended himself without causing any real harm, seemed almost anticlimactic compared to the legends that were already forming. Blake's video of the incident had been carefully edited to show only Sophia's shocked reaction and their retreat from the bathroom, with all evidence of their aggressive behavior conveniently omitted. When he posted it to social media, with captions suggesting that Ethan had attacked Sophia for no reason, it generated exactly the kind of outrage Connor had hoped for. Students who had never spoken to Ethan began viewing him with suspicion and fear, while others who might have been sympathetic were influenced by the carefully crafted narrative that painted him as the aggressor. But the video also had an unintended consequence. A small group of students who had been victims of Connor's bullying in the past watched the footage with different eyes. They saw Sophia's shocked expression not as evidence of unprovoked violence, but as the surprise of someone who had finally encountered resistance. They noticed Connor's uncharacteristic retreat, Blake's nervous energy as he filmed their exit, and the careful editing that excluded whatever had actually triggered the confrontation. Jessica Chen was one of these students, and her perspective was particularly valuable because she had been in the library when Ethan left for the bathroom and had noticed the timing of his departure. When she saw Blake's edited video, she immediately understood that something crucial was missing from the narrative. Jessica had been dealing with Connor's indirect harassment ever since she had been paired with Ethan for their chemistry project, and she recognized the signs of a setup when she saw them. At home that evening, Jessica made a decision that would prove crucial to everything that followed. She called her older brother Tommy, who was now a freshman at Oregon State University, but still maintained close connections to several students at Pine Valley High. Tommy had been Connor's primary antagonist during his senior year, and he understood better than anyone how Connor operated and what kinds of tactics he employed against his victims. "He's escalating," Tommy told Jessica during their phone conversation. "This bathroom thing was just a test. He wanted to see how Ethan would react, and now he knows there's more to the kid than he expected. That's going to make Connor angry, and when Connor gets angry, he gets dangerous." Tommy's prediction proved accurate sooner than either sibling had anticipated. Connor spent the weekend stewing over the bathroom incident, his bruised ego demanding more dramatic revenge than his usual harassment campaigns. The fact that Ethan had made him look weak in front of Sophia and Blake was intolerable. And the carefully edited video that was supposed to damage Ethan's reputation had instead raised uncomfortable questions about why 3 popular students had retreated from one supposedly harmless nerd. By Monday morning, Connor had developed a plan that he believed would permanently settle the question of dominance at Pine Valley High. It was more elaborate and more vicious than his previous campaigns, designed not just to humiliate Ethan, but to completely destroy his ability to function as a student at the school. The plan involved social media manipulation, academic sabotage, and a final public confrontation that would be recorded from multiple angles and shared across every platform where Pine Valley students gathered. The first phase began during second period, when Blake started a whisper campaign suggesting that Ethan had been making inappropriate comments about female students. The rumors were vague enough to be difficult to disprove, but specific enough to create genuine concern among students and teachers. Blake made sure to target students who were known for spreading gossip, and within hours, the story had grown to include allegations of stalking, inappropriate touching, and disturbing behavior in empty classrooms. Meanwhile, Sophia began a parallel campaign focused on Ethan's academic work. She had somehow obtained copies of his chemistry notes and lab reports, which she then used to create fake evidence of cheating and plagiarism. The forged documents were subtle but damaging, suggesting that Ethan had been copying from other students and stealing ideas from online sources. She made sure these documents found their way to Mrs. Rodriguez's desk, along with an anonymous note expressing concern about academic integrity. The psychological pressure was immediate and devastating. By lunchtime on Monday, Ethan found himself completely isolated in ways that went far beyond his usual solitary existence. Students who had previously ignored him now actively avoided him, crossing hallways to stay away from him and changing seats if he sat near them in class. Teachers who had once been neutral began watching him with suspicion, and he could feel their eyes on him during tests and assignments. But Connor's masterstroke was still to come. He had noticed that Ethan always stayed late on Tuesdays for what appeared to be some kind of after-school activity. Connor didn't know about the gym where Ethan trained, but he had observed the pattern and decided to use it to his advantage. His plan was to corner Ethan in an empty area of the school, provoke him into another defensive reaction, and this time make sure multiple cameras captured every moment of what Connor intended to frame as an unprovoked attack. Tuesday afternoon arrived gray and drizzly, with the kind of persistent Oregon rain that made the school building feel closed in and oppressive. Most students had gone home or were gathered in the main areas waiting for rides, leaving the academic wings largely deserted. Connor had positioned Blake and Sophia at strategic points to ensure optimal filming angles, and had recruited 2 other wrestling team members to serve as witnesses and back up intimidation. Ethan was walking toward the side exit where his father would pick him up for his trip to the gym when Connor stepped out of an empty classroom, blocking his path. The hallway was long and narrow, lined with lockers and classroom doors, with no easy escape routes. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows that made Connor's smile look particularly menacing. "Well, well," Connor said, his voice echoing in the empty corridor. "If it isn't the hero who likes to attack innocent girls in bathrooms." Blake emerged from behind a corner, phone already recording, while Sophia appeared from the opposite direction. The 2 wrestling team members, Jake Morrison and Tyler Brooks, stepped out of another classroom, effectively surrounding Ethan in a circle of hostile faces. The setup was carefully choreographed to look spontaneous, while ensuring that Ethan had no way to avoid the confrontation. "I didn't attack anyone," Ethan said quietly, his backpack sliding from his shoulder to his hand in a movement that might have looked casual to the cameras, but was actually a tactical adjustment that freed his movement and provided a potential defensive tool. "That's not what the video shows," Sophia said with mock concern. "That's not what everyone at school is talking about. You grabbed me, you threatened us, and now we're hearing all kinds of disturbing things about your behavior toward other students." Connor stepped closer, using his height and weight advantage to create an intimidating presence. "I think it's time someone taught you that there are consequences for your actions. Time someone showed you what happens when you mess with people who are better than you." The hallway fell silent except for the hum of fluorescent lights and the distant sound of rain against windows. Ethan stood in the center of the circle, seemingly calm, but internally calculating distances, angles, and possibilities. 8 years of training had taught him to assess multiple opponents quickly, and what he saw was troubling, but not insurmountable. Connor was strong but untrained in anything beyond basic wrestling. Blake was small and clearly not a fighter. Sophia posed no physical threat. The 2 wrestling team members were unknowns, but their body language suggested they were followers, rather than leaders. "Just walk away," Ethan said, his voice carrying a note of genuine warning. "All of you, walk away right now, and we can pretend this never happened." Connor laughed, a harsh sound that echoed off the lockers. "Walk away? After what you did? After the way you embarrassed us? I don't think so, freak. I think it's time you learned some respect." He reached out to grab Ethan's shirt, intending to slam him against the lockers for the cameras. It was the same move he had used successfully against dozens of other victims, a display of physical dominance that usually ended confrontations before they could really begin. Connor was confident in his strength, secure in his size advantage, and certain that the scrawny kid in front of him would crumple at the first show of real force. Ethan moved. The speed of his reaction caught everyone off guard, including the cameras that were supposed to capture his humiliation. Connor's grasping hand found empty air as Ethan slipped to the side with fluid grace, and suddenly Connor was off balance, stumbling forward with his own momentum. Before he could recover, Ethan's hand shot out in a precise strike that hit a pressure point in Connor's shoulder, sending shocking pain down his arm and making him cry out in surprise. Blake jerked his phone, trying to keep the action in frame, but Ethan's movements were too fast and too unpredictable. One moment he was directly in front of Connor. The next, he was somehow behind Jake Morrison, whose attempt to grab him from behind had been effortlessly redirected into a throw that sent the wrestler sprawling across the hallway floor. Tyler Brooks, seeing his teammate go down, rushed forward with the kind of aggressive charge that worked well on wrestling mats, but was completely ineffective against someone trained in striking arts. Ethan's response was a textbook example of martial arts efficiency, a simple sidestep that redirected Tyler's momentum, followed by a precise application of leverage that sent him crashing into the lockers with a sound that echoed through the empty hallway. Sophia, who had been recording from what she thought was a safe distance, found herself suddenly face to face with Ethan as he moved through the circle of attackers like water flowing around stones. Her phone clattered to the floor as she stumbled backward, and for the second time in a week, she found herself staring into eyes that held a depth of controlled power she had never imagined possible. "Stay back," Ethan said quietly, but his voice carried an authority that made her freeze in place. Connor, clutching his shoulder and trying to process what had just happened, looked around at his scattered allies with growing disbelief. Jake was struggling to get back to his feet, his face red with embarrassment and pain. Tyler was leaning against the lockers, holding his ribs and breathing heavily. Blake was still filming, but his hands were shaking and the camera was capturing more of his own shock than any useful footage of the fight. The entire confrontation had lasted less than 30 seconds, and none of the supposed attackers had managed to land a single blow or even make meaningful contact with their target. Instead, they were the ones who looked beaten, scattered, and utterly demoralized. The carefully planned ambush had turned into a demonstration of just how outmatched they really were. "This is impossible," Connor said, his voice cracking with confusion and fear. "You're just some nobody. You're nothing. How did you—" "I tried to warn you," Ethan replied, adjusting his backpack and checking to make sure none of his belongings had been damaged in the brief fight. "I tried to tell you to walk away, but you wouldn't listen." He looked around the circle of faces, seeing fear and confusion where there had been confidence and cruelty just moments before. "Here's what's going to happen next. You're going to delete those videos, you're going to stop spreading lies about me, and you're going to leave me alone. All of you, permanently." Blake, still holding his phone with trembling hands, found his voice. "You can't tell us what to do. We'll report you. We'll get you expelled." Ethan's smile was cold and completely without humor. "Report me for what? For defending myself against 5 attackers. Go ahead. Let's see how that conversation goes with Principal Martinez when he finds out you've been orchestrating a harassment campaign for weeks." The mention of evidence made Connor's face go pale. He hadn't considered the possibility that their victim might have been documenting their behavior, and the thought of his parents finding out about organized bullying made his stomach clench with dread. "Besides," Ethan continued, his voice taking on a conversational tone that was somehow more frightening than anger would have been, "I don't think any of you really want this fight to continue, because what just happened? That was me being gentle. That was me showing restraint. If you push this any further, if you make me feel like my safety is actually threatened, then you'll find out what I'm like when I'm not holding back." The hallway fell silent, except for the sound of Tyler's labored breathing and the distant patter of rain. None of the 5 students who had planned to humiliate Ethan could think of anything to say. The power dynamic that had seemed so clear just minutes before had been completely reversed, and they were all struggling to process the implications of what they had witnessed. Ethan picked up Sophia's phone from where it had fallen and handed it back to her with exaggerated politeness. "I believe this is yours. You might want to be more careful with it in the future." Then he turned and walked toward the exit, his footsteps echoing in the empty hallway. None of the 5 students made any move to follow him or continue the confrontation. They simply stood there, scattered and shaken, trying to understand how their carefully planned ambush had turned into such a complete disaster. As Ethan pushed through the exit doors and stepped into the gray afternoon rain, he could hear the beginning of heated arguments behind him. Connor's voice, shrill with frustration and embarrassment, was already blaming the others for the failure of his plan. Blake was insisting that his phone had malfunctioned at crucial moments. Sophia was demanding to know why none of the boys had been able to handle one skinny kid. The rain felt good on Ethan's face as he waited for his father's pickup truck to appear in the parking lot. For the first time in weeks, he felt something approaching peace. The constant tension that had been building in his shoulders was finally beginning to ease, and the knot of anxiety in his stomach was slowly dissolving. His phone buzzed with a text message from his father saying he would be 5 minutes late due to traffic. Ethan used the time to mentally review what had happened, analyzing his performance and considering the potential consequences. He had used minimal force, caused no serious injuries, and had multiple witnesses to the fact that he had been defending himself against a coordinated attack. More importantly, he had finally taken a stand that might convince his tormentors to find easier targets. As his father's truck pulled into the parking lot, Ethan felt a hand on his shoulder. He spun around, muscles tensing for another confrontation, but found himself facing Jessica Chen instead of any of his former attackers. "That was incredible," she said quietly, glancing around to make sure they weren't being overheard. "I saw the whole thing from the library window. The way you moved, the way you handled all of them at once, it was like something out of a movie." Ethan relaxed slightly but remained alert. "How much did you see?" "Everything, including the fact that they cornered you and attacked first. My brother warned me that Connor was planning something big, and I've been trying to keep an eye out for you." Jessica's expression was serious, but impressed. "Where did you learn to fight like that?" "It's complicated," Ethan said, unwilling to reveal too much, even to someone who seemed genuinely friendly. "But the important thing is that it's over now. They got what they were looking for, and hopefully they'll decide to look somewhere else from now on." Jessica nodded but looked skeptical. "I hope you're right, but knowing Connor, this might just make him angrier. He doesn't like being embarrassed, and what happened in there was pretty embarrassing." Ethan's father honked the horn gently, signaling that it was time to go. As Ethan started toward the truck, Jessica called after him. "Hey, Ethan, if you ever want to talk about any of this, or if Connor tries anything else, you should know that there are people who saw what really happened today. You're not as alone as you think you are." As Ethan climbed into his father's truck and they drove away from Pine Valley High, he found himself thinking about Jessica's words. For 2 years, he had operated under the assumption that he was completely isolated, that he had no allies and no support beyond his family. The possibility that he might have been wrong about that was both comforting and troubling. Comforting because genuine friendship was something he had missed more than he cared to admit. Troubling because it meant other people might get caught up in whatever came next. Because, despite his hopeful words to Jessica, Ethan was experienced enough in conflict to know that this confrontation was unlikely to be the end of his problems with Connor Walsh. Bullies like Connor didn't retreat permanently after a single defeat. They regrouped, they recruited more allies, and they came back with more sophisticated strategies designed to ensure that their next attempt would be successful. As the truck navigated the winding roads toward Coach Martinez's gym, Ethan began mentally preparing for whatever Connor might try next. The bathroom incident and hallway confrontation had been defensive actions, reactions to immediate threats. But if Connor continued to escalate, if he started involving innocent people like Jessica in his revenge schemes, then Ethan might have to consider more proactive measures. The thought should have troubled him more than it did. For 2 years, he had maintained his promise to avoid violence whenever possible, and he had genuinely believed that patience and avoidance were the best strategies for dealing with bullies. But the events of the past week had taught him something important about the limitations of purely defensive approaches. Sometimes the only way to stop a predator was to prove that you were more dangerous than they were willing to handle. As they pulled into the parking lot of the gym, Ethan's father finally spoke up. "Everything okay at school today? You seem more tense than usual." Ethan considered his options carefully. His parents knew about his training, obviously, but they didn't know about the bullying or the confrontations. He had worked hard to keep those worlds separate, protecting his family from worries they couldn't solve while protecting his classmates from capabilities they couldn't handle. "Just the usual teenage drama," he said finally. "Nothing I can't handle." His father nodded, apparently satisfied with the explanation, but Ethan caught him studying his son's face in the rearview mirror. David Miller had been a teenager himself once, and he recognized the signs of someone who was dealing with more stress than they wanted to admit. But he also trusted his son's judgment and respected his privacy. So he simply said, "You know your mother and I are here if you need to talk about anything." "I know, Dad. Thanks." As Ethan walked into the gym and began changing into his training clothes, he reflected on how dramatically his life had changed in just a few days. A week ago, he had been an invisible nobody, successfully avoiding attention and conflict through careful planning and strategic cowardice. Now he was apparently known throughout Pine Valley High as someone who could take on multiple attackers and walk away without a scratch. The change brought both opportunities and dangers. On the positive side, his successful self-defense might discourage other potential bullies and could even lead to genuine friendships with students who had previously ignored him. On the negative side, his display of fighting skills had certainly attracted the attention of people who might view him as either a threat to be eliminated or a weapon to be recruited. Coach Martinez appeared in the locker room as Ethan was lacing up his training shoes. The older man had the kind of weathered face that suggested decades of hard living and harder training, but his eyes were sharp and intelligent, missing nothing that happened in his gym. "You seem different today," Coach Martinez observed, settling onto the bench beside Ethan. "More focused, more intense. Something happened." Ethan considered his answer carefully. Coach Martinez was one of the few adults who knew the full extent of his capabilities, and he had always been a source of wise counsel when Ethan needed guidance about the responsibilities that came with his training. "I had to defend myself. At school today," Ethan said finally. "Multiple attackers. I tried to avoid it, but they didn't give me much choice." Coach Martinez nodded slowly. "Anyone hurt?" "Not seriously. I used minimal force, just enough to end the threat. But word is going to get around, and I'm not sure what the consequences are going to be." "The consequences," Coach Martinez said thoughtfully, "depend on what you do next. Fighting skills are like any other tool, Ethan. They can be used to build or to destroy, to protect or to intimidate. The fact that you used minimal force tells me that you understand the responsibility that comes with your training. But now you face a different kind of test." "What do you mean?" "Now you'll find out who you really are when people know what you're capable of. Some students will fear you, others will want to test themselves against you, and still others will try to use your reputation for their own purposes. The question is whether you'll stay true to the principles we've taught you here, or whether you'll let the power go to your head." Coach Martinez stood up and headed toward the door, then paused and looked back. "Train hard tonight, Ethan, but remember that the strongest fighters are the ones who never have to prove how strong they are." As Ethan entered the main training area and began his warm-up routine, he thought about Coach Martinez's words. The older man was right about the tests that lay ahead. The bathroom incident and hallway confrontation had been simple matters of self-defense, but the situations he would face in the coming days would be more complex and more morally ambiguous. Already, he could feel the weight of other people's expectations settling on his shoulders. Students who had never acknowledged his existence were suddenly aware of him, and he could sense their curiosity, their fear, and their calculations about what his revealed capabilities might mean for the social order at Pine Valley High. But perhaps most troubling of all was his own reaction to the confrontations. Despite his genuine preference for avoiding violence, despite his real desire to simply be left alone, there had been something deeply satisfying about finally standing up to his tormentors. The look of shock and fear in Connor's eyes, the sight of his attackers scattered and demoralized, the sudden reversal of power dynamics that had seemed so permanent just moments before, all of it had provided a kind of emotional release that Ethan hadn't expected. That satisfaction was dangerous, he knew. It was the kind of feeling that could easily become addictive, leading him down a path where he might start looking for excuses to use his skills rather than reasons to avoid using them. The line between necessary self-defense and unnecessary aggression was thinner than most people realized, and crossing it was easier than anyone wanted to admit. As he moved through his training routine, practicing techniques that had become as natural as breathing, Ethan made a decision about how he would handle whatever came next. He would continue to avoid conflict whenever possible, would continue to use minimal force when conflict became unavoidable, and would never use his skills to intimidate or control others the way Connor had used his social status and physical presence. But he would also no longer hide from confrontations that were forced upon him, and he would no longer allow himself to be victimized by people who mistook his preference for peace as a sign of weakness. The scared, hunched kid who had walked the halls of Pine Valley High for 2 years was gone forever, and in his place stood someone who understood both the power he possessed and the responsibility that came with it. The rain continued to fall. Outside, as Ethan trained, washing the parking lot clean and promising a fresh start for whatever tomorrow might bring. Inside the gym, under Coach Martinez's watchful eye, he prepared himself for the next phase of his life at Pine Valley High School, a phase that would test not just his fighting skills, but his character, his judgment, and his ability to remain true to himself in the face of expectations and temptations he had never had to consider before. Whatever Connor Walsh was planning for his next move, whatever social dynamics his revealed capabilities might trigger, whatever tests and challenges lay ahead, Ethan was determined to meet them on his own terms, as someone who fought only when necessary, but who would never again allow himself to be anyone's victim. The news of what happened in the hallway spread through Pine Valley High School like wildfire. But unlike previous rumors about Ethan, this one came with video evidence that couldn't be disputed or explained away. Blake's shaky footage showed Connor and his crew scattered across the floor, while Ethan stood calmly in the center, completely unharmed and barely breathing hard. Within hours, the video had been shared hundreds of times across social media platforms, generating comments that ranged from disbelief to admiration to outright fear. Jessica Chen had been right to worry about Connor's reaction to public humiliation. By Wednesday morning, Connor Walsh was a different person than he had been just days before. The confident swagger that had defined his presence at Pine Valley High was gone, replaced by a barely controlled rage that made his friends nervous and his teachers concerned. He moved through the halls with jerky, aggressive gestures, snapping at anyone who looked at him wrong, and spending his lunch periods huddled with Blake and Sophia in intense conversations that always stopped abruptly when other students came within earshot. The social dynamics at Pine Valley High had shifted dramatically overnight. Students who had previously feared Connor now whispered about him with barely concealed contempt, wondering how the supposed tough guy had been so thoroughly dominated by someone they had all dismissed as harmless. The carefully constructed reputation that Connor had built over 3 years of bullying and intimidation was crumbling, and everyone could see it happening in real time. Meanwhile, Ethan found himself navigating an entirely new social landscape. Students who had never spoken to him before now nodded respectfully when they passed him in the halls. Underclassmen who had been targets of various bullies began approaching him tentatively, not asking for protection, but simply wanting to be associated with someone who had proven that the school's predators weren't invincible. Even some teachers began treating him differently, with a mixture of wariness and grudging respect that suggested they understood more about the situation than they were officially acknowledging. But the attention wasn't entirely positive. Ethan quickly discovered that being known as someone who could fight brought its own set of problems. Older students from other cliques began sizing him up with the calculating look of people wondering if they could take him in a fight. Members of various sports teams started making comments about testing themselves against the kid who had taken down 5 opponents at once. The school's unofficial hierarchy of toughness was being reshuffled, and Ethan found himself unwillingly positioned near the top of a list he had never wanted to be on. The most troubling development was the attention he received from Marcus Webb, a senior who had graduated from bullying underclassmen to organizing more serious criminal activities. Marcus was everything Connor pretended to be. Genuinely dangerous, completely unprincipled, and smart enough to avoid the kind of direct confrontation that might get him expelled. He controlled a network of students who sold drugs, stole cars, and ran various illegal schemes that flew under the radar of school administrators and local police. Marcus approached Ethan on Thursday morning, sliding into the seat next to him during study hall with the kind of casual confidence that suggested he was used to getting what he wanted. He was tall and lean, with the kind of wiry strength that came from street fighting rather than organized athletics, and his eyes held the flat, predatory stare of someone who had seen and done things that most teenagers couldn't imagine. "Heard you had some excitement earlier this week," Marcus said, his voice low enough that other students couldn't hear, but carrying an undertone of threat that made Ethan's muscles tense. Pretty impressive, taking on Connor's whole crew like that. Takes skill to handle multiple opponents without really hurting anyone. Ethan kept his eyes on his textbook, but shifted his weight slightly, preparing for whatever might come next. It was self-defense, nothing more. "Sure it was," Marcus agreed, but his tone suggested he didn't believe it for a second. "Thing is, someone with your talents shouldn't be wasting time with amateur hour bullies like Connor Walsh. You could be making real money, doing real work with people who appreciate what you can do." The implication was clear, and Ethan felt a chill run down his spine. Marcus wasn't just offering friendship or protection, he was recruiting, trying to add Ethan's fighting skills to his criminal organization. The fact that he was making the approach so soon after the hallway incident suggested that he had been watching Ethan carefully, evaluating his potential value as an asset. "I'm not interested," Ethan said firmly, finally looking up from his book to meet Marcus's stare directly. "Whatever you're offering, whatever you think I might be useful for, you're wrong about me." Marcus's smile was thin and completely without warmth. "Everyone's interested in something, Miller. Maybe it's money, maybe it's protection, maybe it's just the respect that comes from people knowing they shouldn't mess with you. But everyone wants something, and I'm good at figuring out what that something is." "Then you're going to be disappointed," Ethan replied, closing his textbook and preparing to leave. "Because the only thing I want is to be left alone." "That's not really an option anymore," Marcus said, his voice taking on a harder edge. "You made yourself a public figure when you took down Connor's crew. People know about you now. They're talking about you, and that means you're going to have to choose sides whether you want to or not." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Mr. Peterson, the study hall supervisor, who had noticed the tension between the two students and was approaching with the kind of determined expression that suggested he intended to separate them before anything could escalate. Marcus stood up smoothly, his threatening demeanor shifting instantly to the kind of respectful politeness he showed to authority figures. "Think about what I said, Miller," Marcus said as he gathered his things. Opportunities like this don't come around very often, and they don't stay available forever. As Marcus walked away, Ethan realized that his problems were about to become much more complicated. Connor's bullying had been annoying and potentially dangerous, but it was the kind of straightforward conflict that could be resolved through direct confrontation. Marcus represented a different kind of threat entirely, one that couldn't be handled with martial arts techniques or physical intimidation. The criminal network that Marcus controlled operated in the shadows, using methods that were subtle, sophisticated, and difficult to prove. If Ethan refused to cooperate, Marcus might target his family, his friends, or even his gym, where Coach Martinez trained other young fighters. The man had resources, connections, and a willingness to escalate conflicts far beyond anything Connor Walsh could imagine. That afternoon, Ethan found himself walking more carefully through the school building, paying attention to students he had never noticed before, watching for signs that Marcus's recruitment offer had been followed by surveillance or intimidation. He varied his routes between classes, avoided predictable patterns, and made sure he was never alone in isolated areas where confrontations might occur without witnesses. His heightened awareness paid off when he spotted two of Marcus's known associates, Danny Cruz and Kevin Taylor, following him at a discreet distance as he made his way to his locker after final period. They weren't being particularly subtle about it, which suggested that the surveillance was meant to be noticed, a psychological pressure tactic designed to make him feel constantly watched and vulnerable. Ethan changed direction abruptly, heading toward the main office instead of his locker, and watched as Danny and Kevin had to scramble to adjust their pursuit without making it obvious to the teachers and administrators in the area. The maneuver confirmed what he had suspected. They were amateurs at this kind of work, probably chosen more for their willingness to follow orders than for any particular skill at covert operations. But the amateurishness of his watchers didn't make them less dangerous. If anything, it made them more unpredictable, more likely to escalate situations beyond their ability to control them. Professional criminals might be ruthless, but they were also rational, calculating the costs and benefits of their actions. Amateurs were driven by emotion, peer pressure, and the desire to prove themselves, which made them capable of almost anything. As Ethan waited for his father to pick him up, he found himself thinking about the conversation with Marcus and its implications for his life at Pine Valley High. The criminal's words had contained an uncomfortable amount of truth. Ethan had, indeed, made himself a public figure through his confrontation with Connor, and that visibility brought responsibilities and dangers he hadn't anticipated. The simple desire to be left alone, which had guided his behavior for 2 years, was no longer a realistic option. Too many people knew about his capabilities now, and too many different factions were interested in either recruiting him or neutralizing him. The invisible anonymity that had protected him was gone forever, and he would have to develop new strategies for dealing with the attention. More troubling was Marcus's implicit threat about choosing sides. Pine Valley High, like most schools, had its own version of the territorial disputes that characterized larger criminal organizations. Different groups controlled different aspects of illegal activity, from drug dealing to theft to various forms of extortion, and conflicts between these groups could turn violent without warning. By refusing Marcus's recruitment offer, Ethan had potentially placed himself in opposition to the most powerful criminal element in the school. But accepting the offer would have meant abandoning every principle his parents and Coach Martinez had taught him about using his skills responsibly. It was an impossible choice between physical danger and moral compromise, and Ethan wasn't sure which option posed the greater long-term threat. His father's truck appeared in the parking lot, and as Ethan walked toward it, he noticed Danny Cruz watching him from near the school entrance. The surveillance was continuing even after school hours, which suggested that Marcus was serious about applying pressure until he got the response he wanted. Ethan made a mental note to warn his parents about potential problems without revealing too much about their nature or scope. During the drive to the gym, David Miller seemed to sense his son's increased tension but didn't push for explanations. Instead, he made casual conversation about work and weekend plans, providing a sense of normalcy that Ethan desperately needed. The familiar routine of traveling to Coach Martinez's gym, changing into training clothes, and beginning his workout. Routine helped restore some of his emotional equilibrium. But even in the controlled environment of the gym, Ethan found it difficult to completely relax. The conversation with Marcus had opened his eyes to aspects of Pine Valley High's social structure that he had been naive to ignore, and he realized that his confrontation with Connor had thrust him into the middle of conflicts that went far beyond simple bullying. Coach Martinez noticed his distraction immediately and called him over for a private conversation in the office that adjoined the main training area. The small room was lined with photographs of former students who had gone on to successful fighting careers, and the walls were covered with certificates, awards, and newspaper clippings that documented decades of training champions. "Something's bothering you," Coach Martinez observed, settling into the chair behind his desk while Ethan remained standing near the door. "More than just the usual stress of teenage life. What's going on?" Ethan considered his options carefully. Coach Martinez had always been a trusted advisor, someone who understood both the martial arts world and the broader community of Pine Valley. But the situation with Marcus involved criminal activity that could potentially put the gym at risk if the wrong people decided that Coach Martinez knew too much. "There are some older students at school who want me to get involved in things I shouldn't be involved in," Ethan said finally. "They think my fighting skills would be useful for activities that aren't exactly legal." Coach Martinez's expression darkened immediately. "Criminal recruitment. I was wondering when that would start. Your performance against Connor's group was impressive enough to attract the wrong kind of attention. You expected this." "I've been training fighters for 30 years, Ethan. I've seen talented young people get pulled into criminal organizations before, and it never ends well. The promise is always the same: easy money, respect, protection from enemies, but the reality is addiction, violence, and prison sentences that destroy entire families." Coach Martinez stood up and moved to the window that overlooked the main training area, where other students were working through their routines with the kind of focused intensity that suggested they understood the value of what they were learning. "The question is what you're going to do about it," he continued, "because refusing their recruitment is only the first step. These people don't take no for an answer easily, and they have resources that go far beyond what you experienced with your school bullies." "What would you do?" Ethan asked. "I'd be very careful," Coach Martinez replied. "I'd avoid being alone whenever possible. I'd vary my routines so I couldn't be easily tracked, and I'd make sure my family knew to be alert for unusual activity around our home. But most importantly, I'd remember that running away isn't always an option. Sometimes the only way to deal with predators is to prove that you're more dangerous than they want to handle." The advice was similar to what Ethan had been thinking, but hearing it from Coach Martinez made it feel more legitimate, less like paranoid overreaction and more like reasonable precaution. The older man had dealt with criminal organizations before, both as a fighter and as someone who trained fighters, and his perspective carried the weight of hard-earned experience. "There's something else you should know," Coach Martinez continued. "I've heard rumors about increased gang activity in Pine Valley, conflicts between different groups that are starting to spill over into the schools. If you've attracted attention from one of these organizations, there's a good chance you'll end up dealing with their rivals as well." The prospect of being caught between competing criminal factions was even more troubling than dealing with Marcus alone. Gang conflicts were notoriously unpredictable and often involved innocent bystanders who found themselves in the wrong place at the wrong time. Ethan's family, his friends, even other students at Pine Valley High could potentially become targets if the situation escalated beyond his ability to control it. As Ethan returned to his training routine, he found himself thinking about the chain of events that had led to this point. A few weeks ago, his biggest worry had been avoiding Connor Walsh's attention in the hallways. Now he was dealing with criminal recruitment, gang surveillance, and the possibility that his actions might endanger everyone around him. The irony wasn't lost on him that his attempt to defend himself had created far more problems than it had solved. By revealing his capabilities, he had attracted exactly the kind of attention he had spent years trying to avoid. The invisibility that had protected him was gone, replaced by a reputation that made him valuable to criminals and threatening to rivals. But dwelling on regret wouldn't change his current situation. He was committed now, whether he liked it or not, to dealing with the consequences of his actions. The only question was whether he could navigate the complex web of competing interests and conflicting pressures without compromising his principles or endangering the people he cared about. Friday morning brought new developments that confirmed Coach Martinez's warnings about escalating gang activity. Ethan arrived at school to find Pine Valley High buzzing with rumors about a confrontation that had occurred the previous evening between Marcus Webb's crew and a rival group from Riverside High School. The details were vague and contradictory, but the general consensus was that the conflict had involved weapons, property damage, and at least one hospitalization. The increased tension was immediately visible in the behavior of students who were connected to various criminal organizations. They moved in tighter groups, watched each other with obvious suspicion, and seemed to be preparing for something more serious than the usual territorial disputes that characterized teenage criminal activity. Marcus himself was nowhere to be seen, which could have meant anything from arrested to hospitalized to simply laying low until the immediate crisis passed. But his absence didn't reduce the pressure on Ethan. If anything, it made the situation more unpredictable because his usual contacts and intermediaries were operating without clear guidance from their leader. Danny Cruz approached Ethan during lunch period, sliding into the seat across from him, at the isolated table where Ethan had been eating alone since the Connor incident. Danny looked nervous, constantly glancing around the cafeteria as if expecting trouble from multiple directions, and his hands shook slightly as he leaned forward to speak. "Marcus wants an answer," Danny said without preamble. "Things are getting complicated, and he needs to know who's with him and who's against him. You can't stay neutral anymore." "I already gave my answer," Ethan replied calmly, continuing to eat his sandwich despite the tension radiating from across the table. "I'm not interested in whatever Marcus is offering." "That was before last night," Danny said urgently. "Before everything changed. Marcus is dealing with serious problems now, and he needs serious people to help him handle them. People with your skills." The desperation in Danny's voice suggested that Marcus's criminal organization was under more pressure than anyone had realized. The confrontation with the Riverside High crew had apparently been more damaging than the rumors indicated, and Marcus was scrambling to recruit additional muscle to deal with whatever retaliation might be coming. "My answer hasn't changed," Ethan said firmly, "and if Marcus is smart, he'll focus on his real problems instead of wasting time trying to recruit people who aren't interested." Danny's expression hardened, and for a moment Ethan saw a glimpse of the violence that lurked beneath the nervous exterior. "You don't understand what you're dealing with. Marcus isn't the kind of person you say no to. Neither are the people he's fighting against. If you're not with one side, you're automatically with the other, and both sides have ways of dealing with people who won't cooperate. The threat was clear, and Ethan felt his muscles tense as he prepared for the possibility that the conversation might turn physical. But before either of them could escalate further, Jessica Chen appeared at their table with her lunch tray, sitting down next to Ethan with the kind of casual confidence that suggested she had every right to be there. "Mind if I join you?" she asked brightly, completely ignoring Danny's presence and focusing all her attention on Ethan. "I wanted to talk about our chemistry project. Mrs. Rodriguez says we need to have our preliminary results ready by Monday." Danny looked back and forth between Ethan and Jessica, clearly unsure how to handle the interruption. The presence of a witness, especially one who wasn't connected to any of the criminal factions, complicated his ability to deliver threats or apply pressure. After a moment of uncomfortable silence, he stood up abruptly. "Think about what I said, Miller," he muttered before walking away. "And think fast. Time's running out." As Danny disappeared into the crowd of students, Jessica turned to Ethan with an expression of genuine concern. "Sorry if I interrupted something important, but you looked like you could use some help getting rid of that creep." "Thanks," Ethan said, meaning it more than she probably realized. "Danny's not usually someone I have to worry about, but circumstances have been getting complicated lately. I've noticed the whole school's been talking about what happened with Connor and his crew, and now there are rumors about gang fights and police investigations. It feels like everything's spinning out of control." Jessica's observation was more accurate than she knew. The confrontation with Connor had been the first domino in a chain reaction that was affecting the entire social structure of Pine Valley High School. Criminal organizations that had previously operated in separate spheres were now coming into direct conflict, and students who had nothing to do with illegal activities were being caught in the crossfire. "Have you heard anything specific about what happened last night?" Ethan asked, hoping that Jessica's connection to the school's informal information network might provide more reliable details than the wild rumors that were circulating. "Only that there was a fight between some Pine Valley students and kids from Riverside High, and that someone ended up in the hospital. But my brother Tommy called this morning and said the police have been asking questions about gang activity in both schools, so it might be more serious than people are admitting." The mention of police involvement added another layer of complexity to Ethan's situation. If law enforcement was actively investigating gang activity at Pine Valley High, then his association with Marcus's recruitment efforts could potentially create legal problems, even if he had refused to cooperate. The mere fact that criminals had approached him might be enough to make him a person of interest in any broader investigation. "Jessica," Ethan said carefully, "you should probably stay away from me for a while. I don't want you getting caught up in problems that have nothing to do with you." "Too late for that," Jessica replied with a smile that was both brave and slightly fearful. "I made myself part of this when I sat down at your table just now. Everyone saw me chase off one of Marcus's guys, which means they'll assume I'm on your side, whether that's true or not." The realization that his problems were beginning to affect innocent bystanders was exactly what Ethan had been afraid of. Jessica had intervened out of kindness and courage, but her actions had potentially made her a target for retaliation from criminals who didn't distinguish between active enemies and inconvenient witnesses. "Then we need to be smart about this," Ethan said. "Stay in public areas, don't go anywhere alone, and if anyone approaches you about me or about what happened today, find a teacher immediately." "What about you? What are you going to do if Marcus decides to escalate things?" Ethan considered the question carefully. His options were limited, and all of them carried significant risks. He could continue to refuse recruitment and hope that Marcus would eventually lose interest, but that approach ignored the criminal's increasingly desperate situation and his stated unwillingness to accept no for an answer. He could report the recruitment attempts to school administrators or police, but that would mark him as a snitch and potentially expose him to retaliation from multiple criminal organizations. "I'm going to do what I've always done," Ethan said finally. "Try to avoid trouble, but be ready to defend myself if trouble finds me anyway." It wasn't a particularly satisfying answer, but it was the only honest one he could give. The situation with Marcus and the competing gang factions was beyond his ability to control through direct action, and getting involved more deeply would only increase the danger to himself and everyone around him. As the lunch period ended and students began filtering out of the cafeteria, Ethan noticed that several of Marcus's known associates were positioned near the exits, watching him with obvious interest. The surveillance had become more blatant, less concerned with subtlety, and more focused on psychological pressure. The message was clear. Marcus's patience was running out, and the time for gentle recruitment was coming to an end. Soon, Ethan would be forced to choose between cooperation and confrontation, and either choice would fundamentally change his life at Pine Valley High School. As he walked to his afternoon classes with Jessica beside him, Ethan found himself thinking about Coach Martinez's words about proving that he was more dangerous than criminals wanted to handle. The time for that proof might be coming sooner than anyone expected, and when it arrived, he would need every bit of skill and judgment that 8 years of training had given him. The afternoon passed in a blur of heightened tension and careful observation. Ethan varied his routes between classes, avoided isolated areas, and made sure he was never alone for more than a few seconds at a time. The constant vigilance was exhausting, but it was necessary to avoid giving Marcus's associates any opportunities for private conversations or direct confrontations. By the time the final bell rang, Ethan was ready to escape the oppressive atmosphere of Pine Valley High and retreat to the relative safety of Coach Martinez's gym. But as he made his way toward the parking lot where his father would be waiting, he realized that his problems weren't confined to school hours or school property. Kevin Taylor was leaning against his father's truck, apparently engaged in casual conversation with David Miller. From a distance, the interaction looked friendly. Enough, but Ethan knew it was anything but casual. Kevin was one of Marcus's most trusted lieutenants, and his presence near Ethan's family was a clear escalation of pressure tactics. As Ethan approached the truck, he could hear fragments of their conversation. Kevin was asking about David's work at the auto shop, expressing interest in possibly bringing his car in for service, and generally behaving like a polite teenager, making small talk with an adult. But his eyes never left Ethan's face, and his smile held the kind of predatory satisfaction that suggested he was enjoying the psychological warfare. "Everything okay here?" Ethan asked as he reached the truck, his voice carefully neutral despite the tension he felt. "Just meeting your father," Kevin replied smoothly. "Nice guy. We were talking about how important it is for families to look out for each other, especially when there are dangerous people around." The threat was subtle, but unmistakable, and Ethan saw his father's expression change as he began to understand that this wasn't the innocent conversation he had assumed it to be. David Miller had been a teenager himself once, and he recognized the signs of intimidation when he saw them. "I think it's time for us to go," David said firmly, moving around to the driver's side of the truck. "Ethan, get in." Kevin stepped back from the truck but made no move to leave. "See you around, Miller. Tell your family I said hello." And as they drove away from Pine Valley High, David glanced at his son in the rearview mirror. "Friend of yours?" "Not exactly," Ethan replied. "More like someone who wants to be friends for all the wrong reasons. The kind of reasons that involve threatening families." Ethan sighed, realizing that his attempt to keep his parents out of his problems had just become impossible. Kevin's appearance at the truck had crossed a line that couldn't be ignored, and his father deserved to know at least the basics of what they might be dealing with. There are some students at school who think my fighting skills would be useful for illegal activities, Ethan explained. I told them I wasn't interested, but they're not taking no for an answer. Now they're trying to pressure me by making it clear that they know where my family can be found. David's hands tightened on the steering wheel, and his expression hardened in a way that reminded Ethan that his father had grown up in a much rougher neighborhood before moving to Pine Valley. How serious is this? Are we talking about teenage posturing or real criminal activity? Real criminal activity. The guy who just talked to you works for someone who controls drug dealing and theft operations throughout the school. There was apparently some kind of gang fight last night, and now they're recruiting anyone who might be useful in whatever comes next. And they think you'd be useful because of what happened with those bullies. Exactly. I tried to keep it contained, tried to handle it without getting anyone else involved. But the situation is escalating beyond my ability to control it. David was quiet for several minutes, processing the information and considering their options. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the kind of grim determination that suggested he was prepared to do whatever was necessary to protect his family. We need to talk to your mother about this tonight, and we need to decide whether it's time to involve the police. But first, I want to know exactly what kind of skills you've developed at that gym, because I have a feeling we're going to need every advantage we can get. As they pulled into the parking lot of Coach Martinez's gym, Ethan realized that his carefully separated worlds were about to collide in ways he had never anticipated. The criminal pressure that had started as a school problem was becoming a family crisis, and the martial arts training that was supposed to be his private sanctuary was about to become the focal point of conflicts that could affect everyone he cared about. The simple desire to be left alone, which had guided his behavior for so long, was no longer an option. The choice now was between standing up to Marcus's organization or watching them systematically dismantle everything that mattered to him. And given what he had learned about their methods and resources, standing up to them would require every bit of skill, courage, and judgment that 8 years of intensive training had given him. The emergency family meeting that evening at the Miller household lasted until nearly midnight. David had called Sarah home early from her nursing shift, and the three of them sat around the kitchen table with cups of coffee growing cold as they discussed the escalating situation. Coach Martinez had been invited to join them, his decades of experience with troubled youth and criminal recruitment making his perspective invaluable. Sarah Miller's reaction to learning about the threats against her family was a mixture of maternal fury and professional concern. As an emergency room nurse, she had seen the aftermath of gang violence too many times to have any illusions about what they might be facing. Her questions were precise and clinical, focused on understanding the exact nature of the threats and the resources available to Marcus's organization. The problem with gangs, Coach Martinez explained, as he studied surveillance photos that David had discreetly taken of Kevin Taylor and other suspicious individuals, is that they operate like small businesses. They have territories to protect, revenue streams to maintain, and reputations that determine their ability to recruit and intimidate. When someone challenges their authority or refuses their recruitment, it becomes a business problem that requires a business solution. Meaning what exactly? Sarah asked, though her expression suggested she already knew the answer. Meaning, they'll escalate until they get compliance, or until the cost of escalation becomes too high to justify. In Ethan's case, they're not just trying to recruit a fighter anymore. They're trying to prove that they can force anyone to cooperate, regardless of how much resistance they encounter. David leaned back in his chair, his weathered hands folded on the table. So what are our options? Do we call the police, or do we handle this ourselves? Both, Coach Martinez replied without hesitation. We report the threats and recruitment attempts to create an official record, but we also prepare for the possibility that law enforcement won't be able to prevent retaliation. Gang cases are notoriously difficult to prosecute, and these kids are smart enough to stay just this side of the line that would trigger serious police intervention. Ethan had been mostly silent during the discussion, processing the implications of his family's involvement and considering scenarios that might minimize the danger to everyone around him. But as the conversation turned to practical preparations, he finally spoke up with a suggestion that surprised everyone at the table. "What if I give them what they think they want?" he said quietly. "What if I pretend to agree to their recruitment? Get close enough to gather evidence of their criminal activities and then turn that evidence over to the police." The kitchen fell silent as the three adults considered the proposal. It was risky beyond measure, potentially placing Ethan in the middle of a criminal organization with no backup and no easy escape route. But it was also the kind of proactive approach that might actually resolve the situation rather than simply delaying the inevitable confrontation. "Absolutely not," Sarah said immediately. "I won't have my son infiltrating a gang like some kind of undercover detective. The risks are too high, and the chances of something going wrong are too great." "Actually," Coach Martinez said thoughtfully, "it might not be as dangerous as it sounds. Ethan has several advantages that professional undercover officers don't have. He's young enough to be believable as a recruit, skilled enough to protect himself if things go wrong, and smart enough to avoid the kind of mistakes that usually expose infiltrators." David studied his son's face with the kind of intense attention that came from years of evaluating people under pressure. "You've been thinking about this for a while, haven't you? This isn't something you just came up with." "Since the conversation with Marcus in study hall," Ethan admitted, "I've been trying to figure out a way to end this that doesn't involve anyone else getting hurt. Running away won't work because they'll just follow us. Fighting them directly would be like fighting a hydra, cut off one head and two more appear. But getting inside their organization might give us the leverage we need to shut them down permanently." The debate that followed was intense and emotional, with Sarah arguing for immediate police involvement and relocation if necessary, David advocating for a more aggressive defensive strategy, and Coach Martinez supporting Ethan's infiltration plan with significant modifications and safeguards. By the time they reached a consensus, the first light of dawn was beginning to appear through the kitchen windows. The plan they finally agreed upon was complex and dangerous, but it offered the best chance of resolving the situation without ongoing threat to the Miller family. Ethan would agree to Marcus's recruitment, but only after negotiating specific terms that would limit his involvement and provide opportunities for gathering evidence. Coach Martinez would maintain contact through encrypted communications, and David would coordinate with local police to ensure that any evidence collected could be used effectively. Most importantly, they established clear triggers for abandoning the plan if circumstances became too dangerous. If Marcus demanded participation in violent crimes, if Ethan's cover was blown, or if the organization began targeting his family more directly, he would extract himself immediately, regardless of the consequences. Monday morning at Pine Valley High felt like the beginning of a new chapter in Ethan's life. He arrived early, before most students had gathered for their usual social activities, and made his way directly to the area where Marcus's crew typically congregated. The decision to seek them out, rather than waiting for them to approach him, was a calculated risk, designed to suggest eagerness rather than reluctant compliance. Danny Cruz was the first to spot him, and the surprise on his face was immediately replaced by suspicious satisfaction. Well, well, look who decided to come find us instead of running away. I want to talk to Marcus, Ethan said without preamble. Tell him I've been thinking about his offer, and I might be interested after all. Might be interested? Danny's expression hardened. After all the trouble you've caused, after all the disrespect you've shown, you think you can just walk up and say you might be interested? I think Marcus is a businessman who understands that circumstances change, Ethan replied calmly. And I think he's smart enough to recognize that someone who takes time to make decisions is probably someone who'll stick with those decisions once they're made. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Marcus himself, appearing from around a corner with the kind of perfect timing that suggested he had been watching the entire exchange. His expression was unreadable as he studied Ethan's face, looking for signs of deception or hidden agendas. Change of heart? Marcus asked, his voice carrying a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. Change of circumstances, Ethan corrected. Your people made it clear that neutrality wasn't an option, and recent events have shown me that the situation is more serious than I initially realized. If I'm going to be involved whether I want to be or not, I'd rather be on the winning side. Marcus nodded slowly, apparently satisfied with the explanation. Smart choice, but trust is earned, not given. If you want to work with my organization, you'll need to prove that you're committed to our success and willing to follow orders. What kind of proof? There's a situation developing with some rival crews that requires a particular set of skills that you demonstrated quite effectively against Connor's people. Are you prepared to use those skills for the benefit of the organization? The question was the first real test of Ethan's infiltration plan. Marcus was offering him an opportunity to prove his loyalty through violence, which was exactly the kind of criminal activity he needed to document for the police, but accepting too quickly might raise suspicions, while refusing would undermine his cover story. Depends on what you're asking me to do, Ethan said carefully. I'm not interested in anything that might get me arrested or expelled. I've got college plans that don't include a criminal record. Smart again. I respect that. This particular situation requires intimidation rather than actual violence. Show of force, demonstration of capability, that sort of thing. Think you can handle that? Ethan pretended to consider the proposition while actually evaluating the surveillance opportunities it might provide. A show of force would likely involve multiple members of Marcus's organization, potentially including senior leadership who might reveal information about their broader criminal activities. I can handle it, he said finally. When and where? Tonight, 7 o'clock, behind the old Morrison warehouse on Industrial Avenue. Come alone, and don't tell anyone where you're going. This is your chance to prove you can follow orders and keep secrets. As Marcus walked away with his entourage, Ethan felt a mixture of anticipation and dread. The meeting would provide his first real opportunity to gather intelligence about the organization's structure and activities. But it would also place him in a vulnerable position with no backup and no easy escape route. The rest of the school day passed in a blur of routine classes and careful observation. Ethan noticed that several students who had previously been neutral were now watching him with obvious interest, apparently aware that some kind of negotiation was taking place between him and Marcus's crew. The school's informal intelligence network was remarkably efficient, and news of his apparent recruitment would spread quickly through the student population. Jessica Chen approached him during lunch with an expression of genuine concern. I heard rumors that you were talking to Marcus this morning. Please tell me you're not actually considering getting involved with those people. Sometimes you don't get to choose who you're involved with, Ethan replied, trying to sound resigned rather than purposeful. Sometimes the choice gets made for you. That's not true. There are always alternatives, always other options. You could transfer to another school, or your family could move, or you could report them to the police. Her suggestions were reasonable and well-intentioned, but they also demonstrated how little she understood about the realities of criminal organizations. Gangs didn't respect school district boundaries. Moving was expensive and disruptive with no guarantee of safety, and police investigations required evidence that was difficult to obtain and dangerous to collect. "I appreciate the concern," Ethan said gently, "but this is something I need to handle my own way." That evening, as he prepared for the meeting at the Morrison warehouse, Ethan checked and double-checked the small recording device that Coach Martinez had provided. The device was state-of-the-art, virtually undetectable, and capable of capturing high-quality audio for several hours. If Marcus's people discussed their criminal activities openly, the recording could provide exactly the kind of evidence that law enforcement needed to build a case. The Morrison warehouse was located in an industrial section of Pine Valley that had been largely abandoned since the local economy shifted away from manufacturing. The building itself was a massive concrete structure surrounded by empty parking lots and overgrown loading docks, perfect for clandestine meetings that required privacy and multiple escape routes. Ethan arrived precisely at 7 o'clock, parking his bicycle in a location that would allow for quick departure if circumstances required it. The warehouse appeared deserted from the outside, but as he approached the rear entrance, he could hear the murmur of multiple voices coming from inside the building. The door was unlocked, opening onto a cavernous space lit by a few scattered work lights that created pools of illumination surrounded by deep shadows. Approximately 20 people were gathered in the center of the space, a mixture of Pine Valley, students and older individuals who appeared to be from other schools, or possibly no longer in school at all. Marcus stood at the center of the group, addressing them in the kind of calm, authoritative tone that suggested this was a regular occurrence rather than a special meeting. As Ethan approached, the conversation stopped and all eyes turned toward him with expressions ranging from curiosity to hostility. "Gentlemen," Marcus announced, "I'd like you to meet our newest associate. Some of you may have heard about his performance against Connor Walsh's crew. Tonight, he's going to demonstrate that he's ready to use those skills for more productive purposes." The test that Marcus had prepared was more sophisticated than Ethan had anticipated. Rather than a simple show of force against random targets, the organization was planning a coordinated intimidation campaign against a rival group that had been encroaching on their territory. The operation involved multiple teams, detailed timing, and backup plans for various contingencies. As Marcus explained the operation, Ethan realized that he was witnessing the planning stages of serious criminal activity. The rival group, they were targeting controlled drug distribution at Riverside High School, and Marcus's organization intended to force them out through a combination of threats, property damage, and, if necessary, direct violence. The recording device captured every detail of the planning session, including specific names, locations, and proposed criminal activities. More importantly, it documented Marcus's role as the leader of the organization and his direct involvement in planning crimes that could result in serious felony charges. But the intelligence gathering came at a cost. As the meeting progressed, it became clear that Marcus expected Ethan to participate directly in the intimidation campaign. He would be part of a 3-person team tasked with confronting rival drug dealers at their primary distribution point, using the threat of violence to convince them to abandon their territory. "Think of it as an audition," Marcus explained as he outlined Ethan's specific assignment. "Show us that you can be convincing when you need to be, and you'll find that this organization offers opportunities that go far beyond anything you could achieve on your own." The moment of truth had arrived earlier than expected. Ethan had hoped to gather evidence for several weeks before being asked to participate in actual criminal activities, but Marcus was clearly unwilling to wait. The choice now was between compromising his principles by participating in criminal intimidation or blowing his cover by refusing to cooperate. As the meeting broke up and the various teams prepared to move to their assigned positions, Ethan made a decision that would determine everything that followed. Instead of heading to his assigned location, he slipped away from the warehouse and made his way to a secure location where he could contact Coach Martinez and coordinate with local police. The recording device contained enough evidence to arrest Marcus and several other organization leaders, but acting on that evidence would require precise timing to avoid tipping off other members who might escape or retaliate. More importantly, it would require ensuring that the confrontation with the rival gang didn't escalate into the kind of violence that could result in serious injuries or deaths. Coach Martinez met him at a 24-hour diner on the outskirts of town, arriving with Detective Sarah Morgan, a Pine Valley police officer who specialized in gang investigations. The three of them sat in a back booth while Detective Morgan reviewed the recorded evidence and evaluated their options for intervention. "This is excellent material," Detective Morgan said as she finished listening to the recording. "We have conspiracy to commit assault, conspiracy to distribute drugs, and enough organizational detail to potentially bring down the entire network. But timing is critical. If we move too early, we'll miss the higher-level targets. If we move too late, someone's going to get hurt." The plan they developed was elegant in its simplicity. Detective Morgan would coordinate with her colleagues to position surveillance teams at all the locations Marcus's organization planned to target. When the intimidation teams arrived and began their illegal activities, they would be arrested immediately. Meanwhile, additional officers would move against Marcus and other leaders at their command post locations. "What about Ethan?" Coach Martinez asked. "Marcus is going to know that he was the source of the intelligence, and these people don't forget betrayals." "Witness protection isn't an option for a case this small," Detective Morgan admitted, "but we can make sure that Marcus and his key lieutenants are facing serious enough charges that they won't be in a position to retaliate. The evidence we have should be sufficient for conviction on multiple felonies." As they finalized the details of the police operation, Ethan felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. The infiltration plan had succeeded beyond their wildest expectations, providing law enforcement with everything they needed to dismantle Marcus's criminal organization. But the success had come at the cost of placing him in direct opposition to people who had demonstrated their willingness to use violence against anyone who crossed them. The arrests began at approximately 9:30 that evening as Marcus's various teams moved into position for their coordinated intimidation campaign. Ethan watched from a police surveillance vehicle as Danny Cruz and Kevin Taylor were taken into custody while attempting to vandalize cars belonging to rival gang members. Similar arrests were occurring simultaneously at 3 other locations. Throughout Pine Valley, Marcus himself was arrested at the warehouse, where he had been coordinating the operation via radio communication with his various teams. The look of shock and rage on his face when he realized that his carefully planned operation had been compromised was captured by police cameras and would later be used as evidence of his leadership role in the criminal conspiracy. By 11 o'clock, 17 members of Marcus's organization were in custody, and police had seized enough evidence to support dozens of serious criminal charges. The drug distribution network that had operated throughout Pine Valley High School for years was effectively dismantled, and the intimidation campaigns that had terrorized students and families were permanently ended. But the victory came with a price that became apparent the following morning at Pine Valley High School. Word of the mass arrests had spread through the student population overnight. and everyone knew that someone had provided the police with inside information about Marcus's organization. The fact that Ethan had not been arrested along with the others made him the obvious suspect for the betrayal. Connor Walsh was among the first to approach him, his expression a mixture of grudging, respect, and obvious satisfaction. "Heard you played Marcus like a fiddle," Connor said as Ethan gathered books from his locker. "Got to admit, that takes some serious stones." "I don't know what you're talking about," Ethan replied, maintaining the pretense that he had been an innocent victim rather than an active participant in the investigation. "Sure you don't. Word is that Marcus trusted you enough to bring you to a planning meeting, and somehow the cops knew exactly where to be and when to be there. Hell of a coincidence." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Jessica Chen, who had been waiting for an opportunity to speak with Ethan privately. Her expression was a mixture of relief and admiration as she realized what had actually happened over the past few days. "You were never really going to join them, were you?" she said as Connor walked away. "The whole thing was a setup to get evidence against Marcus." "I can't talk about ongoing police investigations," Ethan replied carefully, "but I can say that I'm glad Marcus and his people won't be bothering anyone at this school anymore." Jessica's smile was radiant as she processed the implications of his careful non-denial. "You're amazing. I thought you were making the biggest mistake of your life, but you were actually planning the most brilliant takedown I've ever heard of." The praise was gratifying, but Ethan knew that his problems weren't entirely resolved. While Marcus's organization had been dismantled, the social dynamics at Pine Valley High School were still adjusting to the new reality. Other criminal elements might emerge to fill the vacuum. Rival gangs might expand their operations into Pine Valley's territory, and there would always be individual bullies like Connor who operated outside of organized criminal structures. More importantly, his own reputation had been fundamentally altered by the events of the past few weeks. He was no longer the invisible nobody who could move through the halls without attracting attention. Instead, he was known as someone who could fight multiple opponents, infiltrate criminal organizations, and coordinate with law enforcement to bring down dangerous criminals. The reputation brought both benefits and responsibilities. Students who had previously been victims of various forms of harassment now looked to him as a potential protector or ally. Teachers and administrators treated him with a mixture of respect and wariness, unsure how to categorize someone who was simultaneously a model student and a proven vigilante. Even his parents struggled with the transformation of their quiet son into someone who could navigate the criminal underworld with apparent ease. During lunch that day, Ethan found himself surrounded by students who wanted to hear first-hand accounts of his confrontations with Connor and Marcus. The attention was overwhelming and largely unwanted, but he recognized that it also provided an opportunity to influence the social dynamics that had allowed bullying and criminal recruitment to flourish at Pine Valley High. "The important thing to understand," he told the gathered students, "is that bullies and criminals rely on isolation and fear to control their victims. They target people who appear to be alone and defenseless because they want easy victories that require minimal effort. But when potential victims support each other, when they refuse to let anyone face harassment alone, then predators lose their primary advantage." Emma Rodriguez, a sophomore who had been terrorized by various bullies throughout her high school career, raised her hand tentatively. "But what if we're not fighters like you? What if we don't have the skills to defend ourselves physically?" "Physical fighting is just one tool," Ethan replied, "and it's not even the most important one. The most important tool is refusing to be isolated. Bullies rely on picking off victims one at a time, away from potential witnesses or allies. If you travel in groups, eat lunch together, walk to classes together, then you're automatically less vulnerable than someone who's always alone." The impromptu discussion continued for the entire lunch period, with students sharing stories of harassment and brainstorming strategies for mutual protection. By the time the bell rang, an informal network of mutual support had begun to emerge, with students exchanging contact information and making plans to coordinate their daily routines. As the weeks that followed demonstrated, the dismantling of Marcus's criminal organization had effects that rippled far beyond Pine Valley High School. The arrests led to investigations of similar criminal networks at other schools throughout the region, ultimately resulting in the conviction of more than 50 individuals on charges ranging from drug distribution to assault to organized criminal activity. More importantly for Ethan's daily life, the social dynamics at Pine Valley High shifted dramatically. The culture of fear and intimidation that had allowed bullies like Connor and criminals like Marcus to operate with impunity was replaced by something approaching genuine community. Students who had previously been isolated found allies and friends, victims of harassment received support and protection, and potential bullies discovered that their traditional tactics no longer worked in an environment where everyone looked out for everyone else. Connor Walsh himself became an unlikely ally in this transformation. His confrontation with Ethan had humbled him in ways that no adult intervention had ever achieved. And the dismantling of Marcus's organization had shown him the ultimate destination of the path he had been following. Instead of escalating his bullying behavior, he began using his social influence to discourage harassment and protect vulnerable students. Turns out being the tough guy isn't as satisfying as I thought it would be, Connor admitted to Ethan. During a chance encounter in the library, several months later, when I saw what Marcus and his crew were really about, what they were willing to do to people, it made me realize that I was heading toward becoming something I didn't want to be. The conversation marked a kind of closure for both students. Connor had genuinely changed, using his natural leadership abilities to create positive rather than negative outcomes for his classmates. Ethan had achieved something he had never thought possible: genuine safety and respect without the need for constant vigilance or defensive measures. But perhaps the most significant change was in Ethan himself, the shy, hunched teenager who had tried to become invisible was gone forever, replaced by someone who understood both his own capabilities and his responsibilities to others. He had learned that hiding from conflict wasn't always possible or desirable, that sometimes the only way to protect what mattered was to take risks that seemed impossible to survive. The self-defense club that he started with Jessica's help became one of the most popular activities at Pine Valley High, attracting students who wanted to learn practical protection skills, as well as those who simply wanted to be part of a community that valued mutual support and personal empowerment. Coach Martinez served as the official advisor, providing professional instruction while ensuring that the focus remained on discipline, respect, and conflict avoidance rather than aggression or intimidation. As graduation approached, Ethan reflected on the journey that had brought him from terrified victim to confident protector. The transformation hadn't been easy or comfortable, and there had been moments when he had doubted both his abilities and his judgment, but the experience had taught him something valuable about the nature of courage and the importance of standing up for principles even when the personal cost seemed too high to bear. The thick eyebrows that Connor and his crew had once planned to shave off as a symbol of humiliation had become something entirely different, a reminder that appearances could be deceiving, that quiet people might possess hidden depths, and that true strength often came from the most unexpected sources. On the last day of his junior year, as Ethan cleaned out his locker and prepared for summer vacation, he found a note that someone had slipped through the vents. The handwriting was unfamiliar, but the message was clear. Thank you for showing us that we don't have to be afraid anymore. He never discovered who had written the note, but it didn't matter. What mattered was that the culture of fear and intimidation that had defined Pine Valley High School for years had been replaced by something better, something that would protect future students from the kind of harassment and criminal recruitment that had once seemed inevitable. As he walked out of Pine Valley High School for the last time as a junior, Ethan carried with him the knowledge that sometimes the most important victories were the ones that prevented conflicts rather than winning them, and that the greatest strength was knowing when to fight and when to find better alternatives. The shy student, who had once been targeted for having unusual eyebrows, had become someone who understood that true power came not from the ability to intimidate others, but from the courage to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. And in a world where bullies and criminals relied on fear and isolation to achieve their goals, that kind of courage was the most dangerous weapon of all. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.